Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we really try to get to the heart of the matter from the sources you send us. Today we're tackling a huge figure, really one of the most iconic and, let's face it, complicated figures of the 20th century, John F. Kennedy.
It's so important we do this because, for 60 years now, the actual history of JFK has often been overshadowed by this incredibly powerful, almost storybook myth.
The Camelot myth.
Exactly. That whole one brief shining moment idea that Jackie Kennedy so famously described. What our sources let us do today is get behind that legend, to find the real person complex, sometimes quite frail, politically sharp, definitely, but behind all that charisma.
Right, and that's our mission here. We've got this stack of biographical political sources, and we want to pull out the key insights, the things that really define his incredibly short but wow, impactful career. We're looking at everything from, the war hero stuff to the Cold War crises that brought us to the brink, and even the hidden struggles he faced just to function day to day. This is the Kennedy story beyond the headlines.
And to really get a handle on the man who became president, you have to start with his family, with that lineage. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, born May 29, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was born into, serious wealth and social standing. Ambition, especially political ambition, wasn't just encouraged. It was almost like the air they breathed.
And that pressure came straight from the top, didn't it? From the patriarch, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. The sources are really clear on this. Joe Sr. was this incredibly dominant figure, almost like a CEO managing his family.
Absolutely. He didn't just sort of hope his kids would be ambitious. He engineered it. He set up these substantial trust funds for all 9 children. Think about that lifelong financial independence.
That's a crucial point, that financial cushion. It meant John and his siblings could jump into politics, which is high risk, often low pay initially, without worrying about making a living.
Exactly. They could focus purely on the political game, on strategy. But, that freedom came with strings attached. This unspoken, lifelong expectation achieve political greatness. It was a trade, really. Financial security for fulfilling the family destiny.
And young Jack, as he was called, he didn't always fit neatly into that mold, especially early on, like at school. The sources talk about his time at Chussie. He was always kind of living in the shadow of his older brother, Joe Jr., who was, the designated heir apparent for politics.
Right, Joe Jr. was supposed to be the one. So Jack, maybe partly because of that, developed this real rebellious streak.
Which led to the Muckers Club.
Yeah, the infamous Muckers Club.
Yeah.
Apparently the name wasn't even theirs originally. The headmaster coined it after catching them setting off a firecracker under a toilet seat or something like that. He called them muckers who would spit in our sea.
And Jack just embraced it.
He did. But what's fascinating is, even with this rebellious side, he still finished 64th out of 112 students. And he was voted most likely to succeed. So the drive, that underlying ambition, it was definitely there even then.
Though his path wasn't exactly straight, he started at Princeton, but health problems flared up, these chronic stomach issues that would basically follow him his whole life, and he had to leave after just a couple of months. Eventually, he landed at Harvard in '36.
And Harvard seems to be where things really clicked, intellectually speaking. He graduated cum laude in 1940, focused on international affairs. But the really interesting thing, and you see the Kennedy machine already working here, is what happened with his senior thesis. It was called Appeasement in Munich.
It wasn't just filed away in an archive. It became a national bestseller, Why England Slept.
Exactly. Think about that for a second. He's 23 years old, and he's already launched himself onto the national stage. Not just as a rich kid, but as someone with serious thoughts on the biggest issue of the day, the looming war in Europe. The book argued for the U.S. and Britain to stand together against, the rising dictatorships. It gave him instant credibility, serious name recognition, way before he ever ran for office. So this intellectual side, this public profile, it pretty quickly ran up against something much tougher, much more visceral, World War II. And that experience, his service, really became the bedrock of his political identity. Which brings us neatly into our first section, Forging the War Hero.
Yeah, and it's so important to remember his ability to even serve was touch and go from the start. He had these really severe chronic back problems. But he was determined. He scrapped his plans for Yale Law School, pushed hard to join the Naval Reserve in 1941.
But he kept getting medically disqualified.
Right. And the sources are pretty blunt about this. His father, Joe Sr., had to step in, used his connections, his influence, provided what the records call misleading medical records.
Think about the risk involved there. For both of them. Getting caught could have been disastrous. But it worked.
He got his commission, ended up in the Pacific, and that sets the stage for the legendary PT-109 incident, August 1943, in the Solomon Islands.
Right. He's commanding the small patrol torpedo boat, PT-109, supporting the campaign on New Georgia. It's a moonless night, very dark, and suddenly this massive Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri, just appears out of nowhere and rams them, cuts the PT boat clean in half.
Just catastrophic. 2 of his crewmen were killed instantly. The rest were thrown into the water, which was on fire from the spilled fuel.
And Kennedy himself re-injured his back badly in the collision. I mean, an injury that should have probably crippled him right there. But the survival story over the next week, it's just incredible.
He was responsible for keeping the rest of his crew alive.
This is where it moves beyond just an accident into, well, genuine heroism. The sources detail how he towed one of his crewmen, Patrick McMahon, who was badly burned and couldn't swim, towed him for 3.5 miles through open ocean.
To this tiny little island, Plum Pudding Island. And he did it how? With the strap of the guy's life jacket clenched between his teeth.
Between his teeth. For hours. Constantly aware of sharks in the water. Just incredible endurance, incredible willpower.
And after 7 days, basically stranded, eating coconuts, drinking rainwater, then came the famous rescue, which itself involved some quick thinking.
Yeah, the coconut message. They managed to carve a message, 11 alive, native nose location, onto a coconut shell. Gave it to a local islander who paddled out and eventually got it to rescuers.
That incident earned him the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, the Purple Heart. But the political impact came from how the story was told.
Absolutely. John Hersey wrote about it for The New Yorker in 1944. And Hersey painted this picture of Kennedy as, modest, kind of self-deprecating, just a guy doing his job under extreme circumstances.
Yeah.
That image resonated hugely with the public.
And Kennedy leaned into it with his humor, didn't he? That famous line when people asked how he became a war hero. It was easy. They cut my TT boat in half.
That kind of dry wit, that understatement, it just worked. It made him relatable, heroic, but not boastful. A perfect political image, really.
But that image was cemented by a terrible family tragedy happening around the same time. His older brother, Joe Jr., the one who was supposed to be the politician.
Right. Joe Jr. was a Navy pilot flying a very dangerous experimental mission over Europe in August 1944. His plane exploded. Right. His body was never recovered.
And the impact of that on the family, and on John specifically, was immense.
It's impossible to overstate. All that concentrated political ambition that Joe Sr. had focused on Joe Jr., it immediately transferred to the next son in line, John. Our sources suggest Jack mourned his brother deeply. He even put together a private book of remembrances called As We Remember Joe. But he also knew instantly that the family's political expectations now rested squarely on his shoulders. His own political career essentially got fast-tracked. By 1946, just 2 years later, he was running for Congress. The path was set. And that sudden shift, that inherited mantle, brings us to Section 2, the political ascent. This is where you really see the Kennedy machine, the family influence, kicking into high gear before we even reach the national stage.
Yeah, the sources make it clear Joe Sr. was still pulling a lot of strings when John first ran for Congress in '47. He apparently engineered the whole thing, got the sitting representative, a guy named James Michael Curley, to step aside.
And then poured money into the campaign. A virtual monopoly on ads in the Boston subway system, mass mailings of that Hersey article about PT-109 to voters' homes. It was a very well-oiled operation from day one.
But once he got to the House, his reputation was a bit mixed, partly because of those ongoing health issues we mentioned.
Right. High absenteeism rate, because he was often ill or recovering from back problems. And some of his colleagues, like George Smathers apparently, felt he was maybe more interested in writing or socializing than the day-to-day grind of legislating.
Kennedy himself apparently found Congress kind of boring, too slow for him.
He seemed frustrated by the pace, yeah. But even with that, he staked out some key positions early on. Supported the Truman Doctrine, which was about containing communism, backed public housing, but also, interestingly, he criticized Truman for the so-called loss of China to the communists, which was more of a conservative talking point at the time.
So kind of positioning himself carefully, setting the stage for a bigger move.
Exactly, which came in 1952 when he ran for the Senate against a major Republican figure, the incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge Jr.
And that was a huge race. Remember, Eisenhower, the Republican presidential candidate, won Massachusetts easily that year.
He did, by a big margin. Yet Kennedy managed to squeak out a victory against Lodge, winning by about 70,000 votes. It was a major upset and showed he could win even when the national tide was against him.
And the sources point to a specific kind of unique campaign tactic that helped him pull it off. The tease.
Ah, yes, the Kennedy women's teas. His mother Rose, his sisters Eunice, Pat, Jean, they were apparently instrumental. They organized countless tea parties across the state, basically mobilizing women voters, reaching them directly in a way that traditional campaigns often didn't. It was incredibly effective.
So he gets to the Senate in 53. But this is also when his health problems really started to ramp up, becoming almost debilitating at times.
Yeah, the Senate years from 53 to 60 were marked by these recurring, agonizing spinal operations. He was often absent for long stretches. At one point, things were so bad he actually received the Catholic last rites. That detail was kept very quiet, of course.
And it was during one of these long recovery periods around 1956 that he published Profiles in Courage.
Right. The book about senators who took principled, unpopular stands was a huge hit. Won the Pulitzer Prize for biography. Massive boost to his image as a serious, thoughtful leader.
But there's a complication with that book, isn't there? The authorship question.
Yes, the sources confirm what was rumored for a long time. The book was largely ghostwritten by his top aide and speechwriter, the brilliant Ted Sorensen. Kennedy came up with the idea, directed the research, edited the drafts, but Sorensen did the heavy lifting on the writing, especially while Kennedy was laid up after surgery.
So Kennedy got the Pulitzer, but Sorensen did much of the work. That's complex.
It is, and it became a point of debate among historians later on. But at the time, the book cemented his reputation.
Even so, his actual Senate record sometimes gets described as a bit thin, like an interlude before the main event. Lyndon Johnson, who'd later be his VP, apparently privately called his performance pathetic.
LBJ could be quite cutting. But to be fair, the sources also note Kennedy did work hard for Massachusetts. He drafted something like 300 bills focused on the state, pushed his Economic Problems of New England program, a 36-point plan for industries like fishing and textiles, much of which actually passed. He co-sponsored the bill creating the Cape Cod National Seashore. So he wasn't inactive, just maybe. His eyes were already on a bigger prize.
And there was that tricky moment with the McCarthy censure vote in 54.
Right. Joseph McCarthy, the anti-communist crusader. When the Senate finally moved to censure him, Kennedy was the only Democrat who didn't vote against McCarthy. He was in the hospital recovering from back surgery.
Which was true, but the timing looked bad.
Very bad politically. Liberals were furious. They suspected he dodged the vote because his father, Joe Sr., was actually friends with McCarthy and supported him. Whether true or not, that absence hurt him with the liberal wing of the party in 56 and again when he ran for president in 60. It showed how carefully he had to navigate the political landscape, even within his own party.
But by 1958, he cruises to re-election in Massachusetts with this record-breaking margin, clearly signaling he's ready for the national stage.
Absolutely. And the 1960 presidential campaign becomes this master class in strategy. The big hurdle was proving a Catholic could win nationally. So he entered key primaries, especially in places like Wisconsin and, crucially, heavily Protestant West Virginia. And he won them. Showed he could get votes across religious lines. He locked up the nomination on the first ballot at the convention.
Then came the VP pick, choosing Lyndon Johnson, which apparently ruffled some feathers, including his own brother Robert's.
Yeah, Bobby Kennedy and many liberals were strongly against picking LBJ, who they saw as too conservative, too much of a wheeler-dealer. But John Kennedy made a cold, hard calculation. He knew he needed the southern states to win a close election, and Johnson, the powerful Senate Majority Leader from Texas, was the key to unlocking the South. It was pure political pragmatism.
And then the general election against Nixon, which brings us to that huge milestone, the first televised presidential debates.
Game changer. Absolutely changed American politics forever. Something like 70 million people watched that first debate.
And it wasn't just what they said, it was how they looked.
Exactly. The story always told is Kennedy looked great tanned, relaxed, wearing a suit that contrasted well with the background. Nixon, on the other hand, was recovering from an illness, looked pale, was sweating under the hot studio lights, and wore a light suit that kind of faded into the gray set.
The famous narrative is, TV viewers thought Kennedy won, radio listeners thought Nixon won.
Right. Though the sources caution that the polling behind that specific claim was a bit shaky. But the bigger point holds true. How a candidate looked and presented themselves on television suddenly became massively important. Visuals, demeanor, stage presence, they became non-negotiable parts of running for president after 1960.
And the election itself, nail-bitingly close.
One of the closest ever. Decided by just 0.2% of the popular vote. Incredible. So at 43, he becomes the youngest person ever elected president. And his inaugural address sets this optimistic, ambitious tone with that unforgettable line, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." The new frontier had arrived. Okay, so now we move into the presidency itself, Section 3, the Cold War crucible. And honestly, Kennedy's very short time in office was utterly dominated by this relentless, high-stakes confrontation with the Soviet Union. Foreign policy was front and center almost from day one.
And one of the first big shifts was moving away from Eisenhower's defense strategy, right? That idea of massive retaliation.
Yeah, massive retaliation basically said if the Soviets make a major move anywhere, we might respond with an all-out nuclear attack. It was a very stark, maybe inflexible doctrine. Kennedy wanted more options. He adopted something called flexible response.
Flexible response, meaning what exactly?
Yes. Meaning the U.S. should have a range of options to respond to aggression, not just nuclear annihilation. So conventional forces, special forces for counterinsurgency, covert operations, and nuclear weapons. The idea was to deter war at all levels, not just the nuclear level, and to avoid painting yourself into a corner where your only choice is apocalypse or doing nothing.
But to make that work, you needed a bigger military, right? To handle all those different potential responses.
Precisely. And the sources show a really significant military buildup under Kennedy. Between 61 and 64, the nuclear arsenal increased by something like 50%. More B-52 bombers, more conventional forces, more submarines. It was a major rearmament program driven by this new strategic thinking.
But it wasn't all about military might. He also tried a softer approach, especially in the developing world.
Right, the idea of winning hearts and minds against communism. That led to the creation of the Peace Corps in his first year, via executive order.
Sending young Americans abroad to help with education, health, agriculture.
Exactly. Kennedy believed that kind of practical help, that person-to-person connection, would make newly independent nations in Africa, Asia, Latin America less likely to fall under Soviet influence.
Yeah.
Tanganyika, now Tanzania, and Ghana were the first countries to welcome Peace Corps volunteers. He also launched the Alliance for Progress for Latin America, pledging billions in aid for economic development and social reform, though its results were ultimately kind of mixed.
So soft power on one hand, but then almost immediately came some very hard power decisions, especially regarding Cuba.
Well, Cuba, yeah. That being a huge focus and the source of one of his biggest early failures. He inherited a CIA plan from the Eisenhower administration to overthrow Fidel Castro using Cuban exiles.
And he gave it the green light, which led to the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961.
Total disaster. About 1,500 anti-Castro exiles, Brigade 2506, landed at the Bay of Pigs. But Kennedy decided at the last minute not to provide the U.S. air support they were counting on. And the popular uprising against Castro that the CIA predicted just never happened. The invaders were quickly defeated or captured. Huge embarrassment for the U.S.
How did Kennedy handle that politically?
Well, he went on TV and took full responsibility, said victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. And interestingly, his approval ratings actually went up afterwards. People seemed to respect him taking the blame. Even political opponents like Nixon and Eisenhower publicly supported him during the immediate crisis.
But they didn't give up on trying to get rid of Castro.
No, definitely not. Later in 1961, Kennedy authorized Operation Mongoose, a campaign of covert operations, sabotage, espionage, assassination plots against Castro. And the sources also mentioned something really disturbing that he rejected in 1962. Operation Northwoods.
What was that?
It was this absolutely wild proposal from the military brass to stage fake terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, maybe hijackings, bombings, even attacks on U.S. military bases, and blame them on Cuba, creating a pretext to invade. Kennedy shut that down completely, thank goodness.
Okay, so all this tension over Cuba is building, and it leads directly to the single most dangerous moment of the Cold War.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. October 1962, 13 days that shook the world. U.S. U-2 spy planes flying over Cuba took photos showing the Soviets were secretly installing medium-range nuclear missile sites. Missiles capable of hitting Washington, D.C., New York, almost anywhere in the eastern U.S. within minutes.
An existential threat, basically, right on America's doorstep.
Absolutely. Kennedy immediately convened a secret group of his top advisors, known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, and they debated intensely, day and night, what to do.
What were the options on the table?
They were stark. The military chiefs, the Hawks, strongly urged an immediate surprise airstrike to take out the missile sites before they became operational, followed by an invasion.
But Kennedy resisted that.
He did. He reportedly called a surprise attack a Pearl Harbor in reverse, and worried it would be seen as immoral and would absolutely trigger a Soviet retaliation, maybe against Berlin or even a nuclear strike. He feared it would escalate uncontrollably, so instead he chose a middle path, a naval quarantine.
A blockade, essentially,
Yep.
stopping Soviet ships from bringing any more missiles or related equipment to Cuba.
Right, while also demanding the Soviets remove the missiles already there. It was a tense standoff. Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. U.S. forces went to high alert worldwide. Nuclear bombers were in the air. It was incredibly dangerous.
How was it resolved? It feels like a miracle it didn't end in war.
It was resolved through a combination of public posturing and secret diplomacy. Publicly, Soviet Premier Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles under UN supervision in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba.
But there was a secret part of the deal, too, wasn't there?
Yes, a crucial secret understanding. Robert Kennedy met privately with the Soviet ambassador and conveyed that the U.S. would, quietly and after some time had passed, remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey and Italy. These were older, basically obsolete missiles, but their presence near the Soviet border was a major irritant for Moscow. That secret trade-off gave Khrushchev the political cover he needed to back down without looking completely defeated.
Wow, so that private deal was key.
Absolutely essential. It averted disaster. The crisis profoundly affected Kennedy. People said he seemed older, more somber afterwards, but his approval rating soared again from 66% up to 77%. And one very practical outcome was the establishment of the Moscow-Washington hotline, a direct teletype link to hopefully prevent future crises from escalating due to miscommunication.
The Cold War heat wasn't just in Cuba, though. Berlin was another flashpoint.
A constant source of tension. Kennedy had a summit meeting with Khrushchev in Vienna in June '61, shortly after the Bay of Pigs. And by all accounts, it did not go well. Kennedy felt Khrushchev really tried to bully him, especially over the status of West Berlin, that small island of democracy deep inside communist East Germany.
How did Kennedy respond to that pressure?
He came home and gave a speech, announced a big increase in defense spending, called up reserves, and made it crystal clear. Any Soviet attempt to cut off Western access to West Berlin would be considered an act of war. He drew a firm line.
And then, just a couple months later, in August '61,
The Berlin Wall went up. Overnight, the East Germans, backed by the Soviets, sealed the border between East and West Berlin with barbed wire, then concrete, to stop the flood of their own citizens escaping to the West.
how did Kennedy react to the wall itself?
Publicly, he condemned it. But privately, the sources say he saw it as a grim, but perhaps necessary, evil to stabilize the situation. He famously said, "It's not a very nice solution, but a wall is a hell of a lot better than a war." He accepted its existence, basically, because the alternative seemed worse.
But he didn't abandon West Berlin.
No, not at all. His commitment culminated in that famous trip in June 1963, where he gave the Ich bin ein Berliner speech. Standing before hundreds of thousands of cheering West Berliners right near the wall, he delivered this incredibly powerful message of solidarity, using the wall as the ultimate symbol of communist failure. "Freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect," he said, "but we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in."
Okay, so Cuba, Berlin,
Yeah.
and then there's Vietnam, which started small but grew under Kennedy.
It did. Kennedy significantly increased the U.S. commitment there. Eisenhower had left about 900 U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam. By the time Kennedy was assassinated in November '63, that number had jumped to around 16,000.
What were they doing? Still just advising.
Mostly, yes, but the role was expanding. Kennedy authorized things like Operation Ranch Hand, the use of chemical defoliants, like Agent Orange, to clear jungle cover. He sent in U.S. helicopter units to provide air mobility for South Vietnamese troops. The U.S. was getting drawn deeper in.
And there was the issue with the South Vietnamese leader, Ngo Dinh Diem.
Yeah, Kennedy and his administration grew increasingly frustrated with Diem. They saw him as corrupt, ineffective, and losing the war against the communist Viet Cong. By late 1963, the U.S. gave tacit approval, maybe even some covert support, to a group of South Vietnamese generals planning a coup.
Which resulted in Diem being overthrown and assassinated on November 1st, 1963.
Just 3 weeks before Kennedy himself was killed. It was a fateful decision that destabilized South Vietnam further and arguably pulled the U.S. even deeper into the conflict, making it harder to withdraw later.
But there's this ongoing debate, isn't there, about whether Kennedy was planning to withdraw.
That's the big question. Just before his death, Kennedy had signed National Security Action Memorandum 263. NSM 263 did order the withdrawal of 1,000 U.S. military personnel by the end of 1963, signaling perhaps a first step towards disengagement.
So was he going to pull out completely?
Historians are really divided on this. Some argue yes, he saw Vietnam as unwinnable, especially after Dima's assassination, and planned a phased withdrawal after the '64 election. Others argue no, the withdrawal of 1,000 men was just a minor adjustment, and the overall commitment remained firm. The same memo, NSM 263, also reaffirmed the goal of defeating the Viet Cong. His death leaves that question tragically unanswered. We just don't know what he would have done.
Okay, let's shift gears now to the domestic front. Section 4. The new frontier at home. Kennedy came in with this soaring rhetoric, this vision of progress, but actually getting legislation passed proved pretty tough, didn't it?
It really did. Part of the problem was that incredibly narrow election victory in 1960. He just didn't have a strong mandate or coattails to pull Democrats into Congress. Plus, Congress itself was dominated by a conservative coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats who were skeptical of a lot of his activist agenda. And, as we've seen, foreign policy crises constantly demanded his attention.
So what were some of the big things he wanted to do that got blocked?
Two major initiatives really stand out. Federal aid to education and medical insurance for the elderly, what would later become Medicare. Both were central planks of the New Frontier platform aimed at expanding opportunity and security, but both failed to pass Congress during his presidency.
But it wasn't all failure. He did get some significant domestic bills through.
Oh, absolutely. Often overlooked, but important. He managed to increase the federal minimum wage to $1.25 an hour. Though, interestingly, he had to agree to exempt laundry workers, who were mostly women and minorities, to get the Southern votes needed. A tough compromise. He signed the Area Redevelopment Act, providing federal aid to economically depressed regions like Appalachia. The Housing Act of 1961 funded urban renewal projects and low-income housing. And a really big one was the Manpower Development and Training Act.
What did that do?
It was a major program to retrain workers who had lost their jobs due to automation or industries declining, trying to adapt the workforce to a changing economy. So while the big headline items stalled, there was real, tangible legislative progress on other fronts.
Let's talk about the economy under Kennedy. It seems like he took a different approach than Eisenhower.
A very different approach.
Yeah.
Eisenhower prioritized balanced budgets, fiscal conservatism. Kennedy came in during a mild recession and immediately embraced a more activist, Keynesian approach. He deliberately ran budget deficits, the first non-war and non-recession deficits, really using government spending and looser monetary policy to stimulate growth.
And did it work?
The numbers suggest it did. GDP growth averaged about 5.5% a year during his presidency, which was a huge improvement over the roughly 2.2% under Eisenhower in the later 50s. Unemployment fell, inflation remained low, the economy was booming.
And part of that strategy was a big tax cut proposal, right? Which sounds counterintuitive if you're running deficits.
It does, but it was pure Keynesian logic, pushed by his chief economic advisor, Walter Heller. The idea was that cutting taxes across the board, including slashing the top marginal rate from a whopping 91% down to 65%, would put more money into the hands of consumers and businesses, stimulating demand, investment, and ultimately generating more growth and even higher tax revenues down the line.
But that tax cut didn't actually pass while he was alive.
No, it was seen as pretty radical at the time, proposing tax cuts when the budget wasn't balanced. It faced resistance in Congress. It was Lyndon Johnson who finally pushed it through as the Revenue Act of 1964 after Kennedy's death. But the intellectual groundwork, the shift toward using tax policy to manage the economy, that was pure Kennedy.
There was also that famous showdown with the steel industry.
The steel price fight of April 1962. A classic example of Kennedy using presidential power. The administration had just helped negotiate a labor agreement to keep steelworkers' wages stable, hoping to prevent inflation. Then, just days later, the head of U.S. Steel, Roger Blau, announced a significant price increase.
Kennedy was furious, apparently.
Livid. He felt completely double-crossed, so the administration came down hard. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, launched antitrust investigations. The FBI started visiting steel executives at dawn. The Defense Department threatened to shift lucrative contracts to companies that didn't raise prices.
Wow, intense pressure.
Tremendous pressure. And it worked. Within about 72 hours, U.S. Steel rescinded the price hike. It was a powerful demonstration of executive muscle, though it definitely spooked the business community and led to a temporary dip in the stock market. They worried about government overreach.
Okay, let's turn to civil rights. This is such a crucial and complex part of his legacy. How did he approach it initially?
Very cautiously. Very politically minded at first. He was personally sympathetic, no doubt. He made that famous phone call to Coretta Scott King when Martin Luther King Jr. was jailed in Georgia during the 1960 campaign, which likely helped him win crucial black votes.
But once in office, he seemed reluctant to push for major legislation.
Right. He worried about alienating the powerful bloc of Southern Democrats in Congress. He needed their votes for his other priorities, the tax cut, foreign policy initiatives, everything else. His brother Bobby, the Attorney General, reportedly said early on the goal was to keep the president out of this civil rights mess as much as possible for purely political reasons.
So what changed? What forced his hand?
Events on the ground, the escalating violence and confrontations across the South, largely driven by the civil rights movement itself, the freedom rides, the sit-ins, the voter registration drives, it became impossible to ignore.
He took some executive actions first, right?
Yes. He signed Executive Order 1925, which required government contractors to take affirmative action to ensure non-discrimination in hiring. And then came the crisis at the University of Mississippi Ole Miss in 1962, when James Meredith, an Air Force veteran, tried to enroll as the first black student.
And there was massive resistance, riots.
Huge riots. Governor Ross Barnett defied federal court orders. Kennedy had to send in hundreds of federal marshals and eventually thousands of Army troops to restore order and ensure Meredith could register. 2 people were killed, hundreds injured. It showed Kennedy was willing to use federal force to uphold the law when directly challenged.
But the real turning point, the moment he fully committed publicly, seems to be June 1963.
Absolutely. The confrontation at the University of Alabama. Governor George Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door, literally blocking 2 black students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, from registering. Kennedy federalized the Alabama National Guard to force Wallace to step aside.
And that same night, he went on national television.
Yes. June 11, 1963, he delivered his landmark report to the American people on civil rights. It was a powerful moral speech. He declared that civil rights was not just a legal issue, but a moral crisis facing the nation. He explicitly committed his administration to pushing for comprehensive federal civil rights legislation outlawing segregation and discrimination. It was a profound shift.
But that commitment came with some difficult baggage, too, particularly regarding wiretapping Dr. King.
It did. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had long been suspicious of King and claimed some of his advisors had communist ties. After Kennedy's civil rights speech, Hoover pressed the administration hard. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, reluctantly authorized wiretaps on King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, supposedly on a limited trial basis, to investigate the communist allocation.
Hoover took that authorization and ran with it.
He absolutely did. He extended the surveillance far beyond the initial scope, using it to gather information not just on potential communist links, but on King's personal life, trying to find ways to discredit him. It's a very dark chapter in the relationship between the Kennedys and the civil rights movement.
And then came the March on Washington in August 1963. How did the administration view that?
Initially, they were nervous, worried about potential violence that could derail the push for the civil rights bill. But they ended up working closely with the organizers to ensure it was peaceful, even had troops on standby just in case. Afterwards, Kennedy met with the leaders at the White House and felt the massive, peaceful demonstration had actually strengthened the case for his legislation.
Which, again, didn't pass until after his death.
Correct. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the landmark achievement, was pushed through by Lyndon Johnson, who invoked Kennedy's memory to get it done.
Okay, one last area of the new frontier, science and the space race.
Right. This was huge for Kennedy. He was directly tied to Cold War prestige.
Yep.
When the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin into orbit in April 1961, becoming the first human in space, it was seen as a major blow to American pride and technological leadership.
So Kennedy needed a bold response.
A very bold response. Just a month later, in May 1961, he went before Congress and committed the United States to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
An incredibly ambitious goal at the time.
Almost audacious. He doubled down on it in a famous speech at Rice University in 1962, saying, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they are hard." It was a massive national undertaking, the Apollo program, driven by Cold War competition, but also capturing this sense of American optimism and can-do spirit that Kennedy embodied. And of course, that goal was achieved, tragically after his death, but achieved nonetheless in 1969. Which brings us to our final section, Section 5. Looking at the private man, his hidden health battles, and his really complex legacy. And you just cannot understand Kennedy the president or Kennedy the person without grasping the sheer scale of the physical suffering he endured, almost entirely in secret.
The public image was all vigor, youth, touch football on the lawn, sailing.
Exactly. The picture of health and athleticism. But the reality, as the sources reveal, was a lifetime of debilitating illness. He had scarlet fever as a child, those terrible gastrointestinal problems, diagnosed as colitis, and the chronic severe back pain, starting from a football injury maybe, worsened by the war that plagued him constantly. It was so bad it forced him out of Princeton early on.
He was basically managing constant pain.
Constant pain. And then the really shocking diagnosis came in 1947 when he was just 30, Addison's disease. It's a rare disorder where the adrenal glands don't produce enough hormones. Back then, the treatments weren't great, and one doctor apparently told him he might only have a year to live. He was also later diagnosed with hypothyroidism.
How did he even function, let alone run for president and govern?
Through sheer willpower and a complex, sometimes dangerous regimen of medications. The sources say he was constantly juggling treatments, often seeing multiple doctors simultaneously. He took corticosteroids for the Addisons, which was essential for survival but had side effects. He got frequent procaine injections, basically powerful local anesthetics, shot directly into his back muscles just to manage the pain.
And there were reports of other more controversial treatments too, amphetamines.
Yes, this is a really troubling aspect. The sources indicate he received treatments from Dr. Max Jacobson, notoriously known as Dr. Feelgood, who administered injections that often contained amphetamines mixed with other substances.
Amphetamines, while making decisions about nuclear war.
It's a deeply concerning thought. Some historians speculate that the effects of these drugs, maybe the steroids combined with the amphetamines, could have impaired his judgment or affected his stamina, particularly during critical moments like that difficult Vienna summit with Khrushchev in '61, where he seemed kind of overwhelmed.
Did anyone try to stop this?
Thankfully, yes. His main White House physician eventually became aware of the extent and danger of Jacobson's treatments and took steps to curtail them, recognizing the risks involved, especially with mixing steroids and stimulants. But the fact remains, for much of his adult life, he was reliant on a potent cocktail of drugs just to get through the day, all while projecting an image of effortless vitality.
That image, the Camelot image, was so powerful. The beautiful family, the intellectual glamour.
It was incredibly appealing. He and Jacqueline brought artists, writers, musicians to the White House. They were young, attractive, seemed sophisticated. He was the first president to really master television with those live press conferences. They seemed like celebrities as much as political figures.
But again, behind the scenes, a more complicated personal life.
Yes. After his death, particularly from the 1970s onwards, revelations emerged about numerous extramarital affairs. The sources mentioned names like Marilyn Monroe, Judith Campbell Exner, who also had ties to mafia figures, a White House intern named Mimi Alford.
And even someone suspected of being a spy.
Right. A woman named Ellen Remetsch, who was reportedly connected to East German intelligence. The potential for blackmail or compromise was significant. J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI knew about many of these activities and kept detailed files, which gave him leverage over the administration. Robert Kennedy apparently had to intervene directly with congressional leaders to keep the Remetsch situation quiet, warning it could trigger a massive scandal.
So the image and the reality were often miles apart, medically, personally.
Very much so, which makes his political achievements and his enduring popularity even more remarkable in some ways.
Which leads us, inevitably, to the assassination, November 2010, 1963.
A day etched into history. He was in Dallas, Texas on a political trip, trying to mend fences within the state Democratic Party before the upcoming '64 election campaign. Riding in an open motorcade through Dealey Plaza, shots rang out around 12:30 p.m.
Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested hours later. But then Oswald himself was murdered 2 days later, live on television by Jack Ruby.
Which just fueled the confusion and suspicion. The official investigation, the Warren Commission, concluded Oswald acted alone. The FBI reached the same conclusion.
But doubts have persisted ever since, haven't they? The conspiracy theories.
They absolutely have. Polls consistently show a majority of Americans don't believe the official story. A later congressional investigation in the late 70s, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, concluded Kennedy was probably killed as the result of a conspiracy, based partly on disputed acoustic evidence suggesting a second gunman. Though later analyses of that evidence have cast doubt on it, the lack of definitive answers continues to feed speculation 6 decades later.
In the immediate aftermath, it was Jackie Kennedy who really shaped the lasting memory, wasn't it, with the Camelot idea?
Yes. In an interview just a week after the assassination, she told journalist Theodore White about JFK's love for the Broadway musical Camelot, quoting the final lines. "Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief, shining moment that was known as Camelot. It perfectly captured the sense of loss, of tragically unfulfilled promise, and that image stuck.
And it's incredibly powerful. Kennedy still ranks incredibly high in presidential polls, usually the top-rated president who served less than a full term. A Gallup poll in 2023 found his retrospective approval rating was something like 90%.
Astonishingly high. His legacy is really this blend of tangible achievements, averting nuclear war and the missile crisis, setting the stage for the Civil Rights Act and the tax cut, inspiring a generation with the Peace Corps and the moonshot, and this intangible sense of possibility of what might have been. You see memorials everywhere, the Kennedy Space Center, JFK Airport in New York, countless schools and roads.
It's interesting, too, that connection he felt to his Irish roots. That trip to Ireland in June '63, just months before he died.
He apparently called it the best 4 days of his life. He was the first foreign head of state to address the Irish Parliament. It clearly meant a lot to him, connecting with that heritage.
So as we wrap up, we're left with this incredibly complex figure, the Cold War strategist, the domestic reformer whose biggest plans were realized after his death, the master of image, the man battling hidden demons.
Which leads us to a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. Kennedy, this grandson of Irish immigrants, was a master of crafting his public image, the vibrant, healthy, intellectual leader of the new frontier. We now know that behind that facade, he was often relying on a risky cocktail of drugs, including amphetamines and steroids, just to function, potentially even during critical diplomatic moments like the Vienna summit, where he seemed to falter against Khrushchev. So what does this reliance on secrecy, on potentially dangerous medical support, tell us about the immense hidden pressures of the presidency, especially during the most dangerous decade of the Cold War? What does the stark contrast between the carefully constructed Kennedy myth and the medically fragile, privately complicated man reveal about the personal cost, the compromises inherent in seeking and holding the highest office, the enduring power of political image itself?